You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, listeners. I want to thank you for joining me today. This is an unusual week. There is a lot going on in the world out there, and I find myself shocked by an election outcome. I suspect many of my listeners may feel the same. Relative to thoughts on advocacy for women and minorities in STEM, I can't help but wonder, will putting someone like this in power in the U.S. set back our efforts via emboldening those who both wield power and harbor prejudices against women and minorities? To all the young women out there listening to this, I feel like there's an important message for you to hear right now. And that message is simply, you do not have to stand for anyone treating you poorly or lesser in the classroom or workplace because you are a girl or because of your ethnicity. Even more importantly, we will stand beside you. You are not alone. I simply couldn't release a typical episode today. I called on a couple of fellow advocates and asked if we could simply have a discussion about some of these thoughts. After recording it, it really felt to me that this would be the beginning of several more conversations to come on the STEMxm podcast. Through it, I also realized that another important topic we need to bring up is the uncanny U.S. distrust of science. This is a problem, and it's something that we as scientists, engineers, and future scientists and engineers have a moral imperative to address. So I'd like to get into the recording now. Thank you for joining us today on STEMxm, and I'll be back with you again at the end to discuss show notes and some other items. Here we go. Given the election outcome, I feel it's important to shift from our regular career interview podcast this week and have a discussion about what it means to move forward. On the STEMxm podcast, we highlight women in STEM fields. Most of these fields are still dominated by males on the career path. We highlight women not only to showcase their accomplishments, but we hope these interviews can inspire young generations of future scientists, engineers, technologists, and mathematicians to shoot for the stars. So where are we today, November 13th, 2016? Although we can't predict the future, I believe that our president-elect's overt sexism, racism, and contempt for those with disabilities has the potential to embolden those who harbor prejudices against these groups. Therefore, I think that there are several important conversations at hand, and in my opinion, they are important for the upcoming years because I believe we cannot allow the rhetoric that we've had from Donald Trump to diminish our work toward gender and racial parity, in particular in the STEM fields. So some of the questions on my mind are, how can we address unconscious gender bias in the STEM workplace? How can we call out overt sexism in the workplace and academia? How can we foster showing the young generation of girls and women strong examples of empowered women? So to that end, I have two guests joining us today. We have Mariel Kolker. Ms. Kolker earned a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Rutgers in 1987. In her early career, she worked for Con Edison in manholes, inside transformers, power plants, substations, and the Emergency Control Center. She went on to earn an MBA in finance from Fordham in 1995, and she worked in finance for Con Edison and in the marketing and operations department for PSE&G. She transitioned to a teaching role in the year 2000, and today Ms. Kolker teaches at Morristown High School. She teaches physics and engineering courses. Ms. Kolker strives to bring real-world practicality to teaching of both physics and engineering. She focuses on skills that are relevant and desirable in the workplace. Mariel, thank you so much for joining us today on STEMxm.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We also have Dr. Jack Gilbert. Professor Gilbert earned his PhD from Unilever and Nottingham University in the UK in 2002. He received his postdoctoral training at Queen's University, Canada. He returned to the UK in 2005 to Plymouth Marine Laboratory as a senior scientist until his move to Argonne National Laboratory and the University of Chicago in 2010. Currently, Professor Gilbert is in the Department of Surgery at the University of Chicago and is group leader for microbial ecology at Argonne National Laboratory. He's also Associate Director of the Institute of Genomic and Systems Biology, Research Associate at the Field Museum of Natural History, and Senior Scientist at the Marine Biological Laboratory. Dr. Gilbert uses molecular analysis to test fundamental hypotheses in microbial ecology, and he's published many research papers, received many awards, and notably, he stands as an advocate for women in science. Jack, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start with an open-ended question for both of you. Could you speak to us about the difference between unconscious bias and sexism in the workplace and the implications for both in the STEM classroom and the STEM workplace?
Sure. Let me just define for the listeners what implicit bias is. Implicit means, in this case, it means unconscious. So what we're talking about here are bias decisions and bias events that the person who's enacting them is not aware of, or is not aware of his or her own thinking. So these are things that are not something that they are aware of, and that they are not realizing that they are doing. So in the classroom, we see these with regard to the way that girls are treated differently from boys. When we're speaking about gender, we're talking about the way that we speak to our girl students and the way that we view them. And what we'll often hear teachers saying, and women are as complicit in the implicit bias as are men in the United States, and it has to do with the environment that we are raised in and the culture that we live in. And so female and male teachers will all tend to take a look at a boy who's good at physics, let's say, or mathematics, and say, "You are a natural. You are somebody who just gets it. You're somebody who is very intelligent." When they speak about girls who are receiving the same grades and doing just as well, what they say to the girls or about the girls is hard worker, very studious, very organized. And this has been actually, it's quite pervasive in the high school classroom and in all really K-12 classrooms. And until you point it out, teachers are not aware that they do that, but it's very pervasive. So that's one way. And then this translates into the way that we speak to the students and the messages that the students get.
Right. So let me add on to that. As a man working in a scientific community and academic workspace, and also having been part of commercial organizations in biological sciences, and having what I would say is a senior role in an organization in a scientific field which is dominated by women and men. I mean, biological sciences generally isn't like engineering. It's not like physics and math, where there is a male-dominated area. There is a definitively large quantity of women in my field. I've always struggled to perceive the inherent biases within our community. I guess that's the whole point about them, right? They're hard to see. And within my own milieu of the people I interact with, I'm very adamant about trying to, reduce the instances that people perceive bias by actively tackling those biases head on. And a lot of that has to do with tackling or making changes and tackling observations which people can't see or don't understand. And therefore, it's often very difficult to get people to change their behavior, to change the way they are working in these scientific areas in their day-to-day lives, to address those changes, because they don't see why they should be making those changes. And that's been the hardest component, I think, of trying to deal with implicit bias in the workplace that I deal with. And I find it very it's a very important point to make that women are complicit in this as well. And in many instances, some of the senior women in my field, I've had conversations with them where we've not seen eye to eye on the necessity for certain changes in our operational practices in order to try and reduce those implicit biases. I also want to point out that, gender bias is just one of those biases that are implicit. There are obviously racial biases. There are socioeconomic biases that are implicit within our society and definitely within our academic sphere. So there are many aspects of this which need to be dealt with. It's just sometimes it's very hard to get people to see them. I know that because it was very hard for me to perceive them in the first place. I thought that we didn't have any of those such biases in our workspace, and it took me being educated by women in my community and by men in my community who are explicitly tackling these issues for me to be able to see them and deal with them.
Absolutely. I think those are important points, and we as women definitely have some of these unconscious biases or implicit biases as well. Mariel, you have written about this in one of your blog posts where you talk about the difference between parents' reception to the idea of telling them that their son versus their daughter is a good candidate for AP Physics or AP Mathematics. I think in one of your blog posts you wrote that you had a parent of a daughter that was surprised by this, whereas the parents of sons are kind of expect it, or they're just excited about it. And do you have any comments on that?
Yes. How long do you have? I have a constant education process. As Jack was saying, we need to educate everyone around us. So, and it's incredibly hard because just by nature of the fact that it's implicit, none of us, unless you have, some education in this, or if you've read about it, you really are not aware that this is happening. And parents play a crucial role because they're the ones who have some of the strongest influence over my students, and I'm continuously astounded by the things that come out of some of their mouths. So the case that you were talking about that I wrote about was, the response from mothers. They say, I didn't know my daughter was eligible to take engineering. There's an engineering class that we teach at the secondary level. And it's not a question of being eligible. It's just a class that you sign up for. And then I heard it again and I heard it again. Wow, I'm so honored that my daughter is, being recommended to this class. And it's astounded. I've never heard any of that come out of the mouths of parents of boys. But since writing that, I even had something very interesting. A mother and a father were talking to me about, this was just last year, a year ago, in November. They said, I said, she's spectacular in physics, and I highly recommend that she consider engineering. And by the way, we have an engineering class. And they smiled and said, actually, we're looking at architecture for her as a major, as a career. And I said, oh, that's great, but there are not nearly the number of jobs in architecture as there are in engineering, and there's not as much pay. The pay scale is much lower than for engineers. I said, civil engineering. Can we talk about civil engineering for her? And the father looked at me and said, well, I'm a civil engineer, and her two older brothers are civil engineers, but she's more creative, and so we thought that architecture would be better for her. And therein lies the rub, right? That the perception is that engineering can be creative, and that it's not a female it's not a female profession, and that it fits better into their view of the world, that their daughter would not go into engineering, that she would go into architecture, which is not by any means, it's not easier, and it's not any less rigorous. It's just that it's a differentiating based on defining the roles of what men should do versus what women should do. If it's good enough for the brothers, it should be good enough for the daughter or the sister. So I see this all the time, and what I try and do is educate all the players, right? So I'm educating the other teachers in the school, or actually really what I'm doing is I'm speaking to teacher conferences at NSCA science teacher conferences and math teacher conferences. I'm trying to speak with guidance counselors because they play a huge role in just even bringing up or not bringing up, the options, the pre-engineering options. And I'm speaking to parents, and then I'm speaking to girls. I'm trying to get girls to see that these are opportunities and these are possible for them because they often don't see it. The woman, Debbie Sterling, who is the founder of Goldilocks, says on her blog that she had one high school teacher say to her, a math teacher say to her, you should consider engineering. And the woman, what she said was, and I couldn't understand why he thought that I should drive a train, which is a really old-fashioned and kind of ridiculous response. But no one had ever spoken to her about engineering, and she did not know what it was. She went to Stanford. She took an mechanical engineering course her freshman year, and she loved it, and she became a mechanical engineering major, and she graduated with a degree in engineering because somebody said to her, you really should think about this. And I think the bigger picture is not so much that one teacher said it to her, but that no one else did. None of her other teachers, her guidance counselor, and her parents. It occurred to no one else to speak to her about engineering when she was good in math and she was good in science. So it's a difficult road trying to change perceptions and to educate people into thinking about these things. And you do it one student at a time.
Absolutely. I'd like to kind of build on that thought that you're talking about there. So, clearly this has an impact on the decisions that women make when they're choosing a major, when they're choosing a career path. And I wonder at the research level, Jack, if you ever see these kinds of it's almost like an identity problem or lack of confidence that might come through. Do you ever experience this with, your research students that you're helping guide?
Well, I mean, absolutely. So it became almost a paradigm, which is always hard to shift within the community that, your female students, and I was taught this almost, your female students will need to be pushed harder to accept more difficult research programs that they may not be absolutely specialized in, because they will automatically want to make sure that they could deliver upon a project as an expert and not fail in it, right? Whereas men, this is the paradigm, not my opinion, but men are much more willing to throw their lot in comprehensively, even if they have no real skills in that area, just to prove that they can, tackle a complex problem. And it's a little bit ridiculous, right? But you see behaviors in the field that do mirror that hypothesis, that women are less willing to put themselves out there. They if they're going to say yes to taking on a research project, they want to be sure that they can deliver on it 100%. Whereas a man can be about 10% ready to deliver on something and say, yeah, no, I'll go and do it. Absolutely. No worries. Yeah. And then they run off and try and figure it out. Right. And there is that confidence issue. And for many, many years, I just assumed that confidence issue was some kind of inherent difference between men and women. And I honestly, over the last couple of years, at least, I think I've changed my perspective on that. That there are the subtleties of education and the subtleties of the inherent bias mandate in that women experience growing up and and through their developmental process has to have altered their willingness to accept that consequence, right? And I honestly can't see a biological reason why women would be less willing to stretch themselves beyond their existing and extant expertise. It just seems ridiculous to assume that. So, from my perspective, I think there's a necessity to shift that paradigm forcibly, and to ensure that everybody in my research group and everybody that I interact with understands that you don't have to act like a man, if you want to put it in those phrases, to get on in this world. But you do also have to be willing to explore the limits of your abilities, to throw yourself into research programs and not be afraid that you're going to fail, because part of science is failure, right? We fail 99% of the time in order to succeed 1% of the time. And in the biological sciences, that is extraordinarily true. And I think that for me, that's what we need to push upon all of our candidates, male, female, whatever, in order to enable them to succeed that 1% of the time. Try and push yourself, and don't be afraid of that failure element.
Yes, and if I may, that is so completely true. There are girls. I mean, we see them at the high school level. They're afraid to fail already. And I had and it's well documented that this is what girls do. And you're absolutely right. I spoke to somebody who was an educator at the middle school level, and interestingly, he had said just recently, to me that girls are, if you think about what it's like in a middle school classroom, girls already have the skills to be able to sit still and to do what they're told. In fact, they're quite good at it, and the boys are not yet there. They are, they're goofy, and they're sometimes crass, and they're just not able to stay in their seats. And what he said was that what the girls are told is, good job, you did a good job, that, so it's all focused on product. And boys are told, you have to keep trying. And if you keep trying, you'll be able to do this. And what that works out into is what Carol Dweck refers to as the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. If you're told, keep trying and eventually you will do well and you will be able to get it, if you keep praising effort instead of results, people grow up to believe that they are able to, as you said, go off and figure it out. And when you praise the results, it is more of you're organized, you put everything together, and you're either capable of doing it or you're not. And nobody knows where this starts or why boys get this different message than girls, but it is absolutely manifest by the time that they are considering careers in colleges. And that also can be part of the reason why girls don't. There are a lot of reasons why girls aren't going into engineering, but it can be part of it. I do know that I had girls in my engineering class, with an A in engineering and, doing very well on their SATs and very well on their GPA, nervous about applying to engineering schools. And, it turns out when you talk to the engineering schools, like when I've spoken to people at Rutgers University, and what they see is the girls who are applying are just the cream of the crop. And the boys who apply, the range of boys that apply to engineering school because they really just think they'd like to be an engineer is much, much broader. So boys aren't afraid to apply, even if they've got, a 550 or a 650 on their SAT score out of 800, and a girl will need to have a 750 or a 780 before she'll consider applying to engineering school. And so it just affects the process all the way through. And it's a very real problem, and no one's figured out yet how to fix it, how to address it in the workforce and in education.
Jack, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think that's riffing off of my comments anyway. I mean, in my opinion, the only way to address it, we can talk about how to deliberately change a paradigm, even if people don't feel that paradigm exists. But in a minute, but my opinion is the only way to change it is to almost give people the opportunity, balance those opportunities, and help women especially to see that they do not need to be perfect to apply for this, or do not need to be perfect to do it. They can choose their passion and their heart, and use that to make a decision about their life, rather than having to fit the perfect paradigm. That being said, I've got two boys. I was out for breakfast yesterday with some friends of ours, one of whom had a boy and a girl, and one of whom had two girls. And those are all around the same age, 7 to 9, 7 to 10. And the boys sat on one side of the room, smacking each other with chopsticks, and the girls sat on the other side of the room, sitting down quietly and discussing things. And at what age does this dichotomy start? How much of it is biological and how much of it is learnt behavior? I can't tell. But the division is very, very obvious very early in life. And so there is the necessity to potentially accept some of those derivatives, right? And then incorporate them into how we work in our working place, so that it's not a workplace or a academic developmental situation that is successfully selecting for male behaviors, but one that successfully selects for all behaviors and provides opportunities therein.
Okay, I'd like to ask now to both of you, what do you think about the importance of role models for young women, and seeing other women or people of color doing the types of jobs that they want to go into? Do you have any examples of students that you've worked with where maybe they were influenced by a certain person that was a role model for them? How do you see this being important for the young generations today?
I'd like to tackle that head on straight away, if that's all right, Mr. But in my field, where we do have a reasonably strong gender ratio, right? It's not perfect, but it's much stronger than other fields. You brought up people of color, African Americans, Hispanics. We have a very, very low ratio for people of color and other ethnicities in our field, right? And so that's a perfect example whereby seeing a black man or a black woman up on stage presenting research at the top of their game and demonstrating themselves as being leaders in the field, right, is extremely impactful. It has a huge impact upon how those people in the audience see themselves. And the same is true for women, right? So, having strong leadership role models up on the stage, I have been told numerous times, is very impactful. I mean, the reasons that you and I came to know each other is because we are pushing to ensure that there is that strong racial and gender representation at scientific meetings. My colleague Jonathan Eisen has been pushing this extensively for years, and it's becoming more concerning to more people in the field. And there is a necessity to ensure directly that people in the field are actively trying to do it. We can talk about the excuses as to why it's not done more regularly in a minute if you want, but yeah, it's extraordinarily important that people see people who are like themselves in certain ways up there on the stage showing leadership roles. For whatever reason, I think that that's an inherent component of what makes a strong case for making sure that you drive yourself towards those positions.
Right. There's I agree. Although I will say that I think that the role model paradigm is a double-edged sword, because too often we rely on conversations about we talk about the the one woman who's done this or the one woman who did that, or we put posters on the wall, in the science classroom. And that's not what we're really talking about. That doesn't help at all. That has been actually demonstrated to not influence girls. What does help is actually having people in front of them. So bringing engineers in. We just recently had some civil engineers, some young women who are civil engineers, come in and talk to the girls at my school, and that was extremely impactful. So it's in the right venue and in the right and it's person to person and absolutely not too huge of a gap. Talking about a Nobel Prize winner to somebody who is in high school is just too far of a reach. They can't see themselves there. In 2013, Cornell University did a study on gender occupational plans and college major selection, and what they said was that girls just don't see themselves. And this is true. It's not true from the report, but I believe that to be true about minorities as well in engineering, computer science, that students just don't see themselves in these roles as adults. And so when you put someone in front of them, not someone who is, an astronaut who's been in space, but someone who has a job, who does something interesting, who looks like them, and they can actually talk to them and they can identify with them, that becomes very, very impactful and very, very useful in helping students bridge that gap where they can actually visualize themselves in that role in 10 years.
I can agree with that more. I just want to riff on that a little bit further. I worked with my son's schools in order to try and ensure that there was a much stronger representation of female speakers coming and talking to them, even at the kindergarten level, right? At kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And so I actually instigated a program where I brought in strong female characters, is the best way to describe some of them, from around Chicago to come and speak about, their experiences and their life, just, for 10 minutes. And I honestly feel that having those physical people in the room is the biggest and most impactful thing we can do. And you should start as early as possible. But, even then, yesterday, Friday, I was giving a talk to my youngest son's class, and they're first graders, so 6 and 7 years old. And, I brought in a Women in Science book, and there's a long list of famous female scientists. You could challenge most people to name half of them, and they'd probably fail. But there is a huge list of people out there that have had a massive, impactful role. And one little girl came up to me at the end and goes, "I had no idea that computer programs, were developed by women." She's like 7 years old, and I was blown away by that. And for me, that level of education coming from any sphere is going to have a big role to play in helping people to reshape their consideration of who they're going to be later in life.
Absolutely. So in terms of what's going on right now in our country, I wonder if either of you have any more thoughts on what we show to young women as examples of a strong woman or something to aspire to be. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of what's going on politically right now?
Well, I would like to say that I just had the fortune of seeing Michelle Dickinson speak. She is otherwise known as Nano Girl. She's out of Auckland, New Zealand, and where unfortunately there was just an earthquake. But she was fabulous. So she's got her PhD in, I believe, materials engineering, and she speaks and she does videos. She's a fairly well-known TEDx speech. And what she said, which we were talking about, was she likes to get dirty and to break things, and this is her, what she says, and that she does that in her lab, in her nanoscience lab. And she says, when you look around at the world and who who are the role models, for boys. Boys are encouraged to get dirty and to break things, and girls are who are the role models for girls. And she pulled up a picture of the, Hollywood, the Kardashians, and she said, girls are told that their goals are to be rich and famous, or rich and famous and beautiful, and I really do think that resonates with girls. I have in one of the presentations that I give, I've got a slide of the Big Bang Theory. Now, I am a fan of the Big Bang Theory because they are physicists and engineers, and that's kind of my world, and I get it, and I absolutely love that they've got a physicist consulting on the show, so that all the science that they've included in it is completely valid. And I'm so immersed in the culture myself that I didn't even see until I really started to try and articulate the problem of implicit bias, the difference between the two characters, who names escape me. Maybe you can help me, Mel. Penny, I think is the one, right? Who is just really pretty and very nice and not very smart. At least this is how they cast her in the beginning. And then I guess it's Sheldon's girlfriend, who is very smart and has deliberately been made not to be pretty. And when you ask a bunch of, like 6, 7, 8-year-olds, who do you want to be like? Nobody's choosing the smart, the PhD. No, that's just not what the culture has told us is important, that we need to be able to do. And so it's a problem that's bigger than just what's inside the classroom. It's the culture. And it concerns me tremendously. So that's why I'm in education, so that I can try and make a difference. But as I said, one girl at a time.
I completely.
One. Can I just talk to that?
Yes.
One of the problems with that is that all of the male lead roles in there are also super geeky, and as a man growing up as a bit of a geek, even though I learned how to socialize myself. Especially in America, if you don't play sports or if you don't understand sports like me, I abhor them. You are pretty much on that periphery and forced into that kind of geek gender. So for me, the men and the women geeks on that show are both representative of a social class structure, and the gender groupings are pretty much the same. Penny's boyfriends, who she brings in before she, marries the geeky one, were all hot, big, strong guys, who were pretty dumb. So maybe there's a social commentary there that spans gender, or shifts across it rather than explicitly make statements otherwise.
But they do make but it is okay in American culture to be a geek. I mean, it's actually more than okay. That's an absolute. Those guys are, they're it's a very self-deprecating show. They make fun of themselves, but that is something that men can see themselves doing and being, and that's part of it's not part of the sports culture. You're absolutely right, but it is something that is accepted. And they're also, you have to remember, they're also well established in their careers, right? And they're working on really important things. And so she marries him, right? So that validates it. So it's still very accepted. Whereas I just don't see that for women, other than being pretty and half naked on television.
Well,
I agree with that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like the geeky guy in our culture, in American society, still has this value because that geeky guy, well, he's really smart, so he can develop Facebook and become a billionaire, but.
Right.
There's something else happening in the messages that are being projected down to young women, to where, as you pointed out, Mariel, if they're asked who they want to be more like, they want to be like the pretty one, not like the smart one. Well, why is that? That's because somehow they are understanding a message that says, well, you're a girl, and for you to be valuable to society or to a future partner or whatever, your value is in being pretty, not in being smart, figuring things out, being innovative, that type of thing.
Right. And unfortunately, here we have Melania Trump as our first lady. And that is going to do nothing but, that's my fear, is that it's going to do nothing but reinforce that's how you succeed in this world, is to be a model. And, I've seen some things written about Hillary Clinton, but a lot of that, they include references to her looks. Okay, Donald as well, but it's always more of an issue and considered valid to criticize a woman based on her looks, I think, than it is to criticize a man.
I fully agree.
You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, episode 9. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer, and our guests today are Mariel Kolker, mechanical engineer turned educator, and Dr. Jack Gilbert, a researcher in microbiomes. So maybe we should switch gears a little bit. One of the things that people have been commenting on also is bullying. A lot of people have pointed out that we've elected this person who basically bullies others and causes others to incite that type of behavior. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on this in terms of women and minorities or disenfranchised groups in the STEM world.
Jack, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, this is a complicated one because bullying is something a lot of people experience, and to be perfectly honest, those kind of detrimental behaviours which are manifest by a small group of people in order to try and assert control over people who they are threatened by are quite well represented across the board. So whether this is explicitly a gender or a racial stereotype thing, or if just being a liberal could be you bullied for standing up for positive affirmation. Bullying is a universal horror and not something that I think is linked to one specific group of people or not. But it's there is bullying inherent in all forms of academic world. We're probably immune to it to a certain extent, but it's still very explicit. And the sexual bullying that does go on between men and women is something which has to be dealt with and has to be a focus of renewed activity to eradicate it. But we're still struggling to figure out a way to make that explicit.
I would like to answer with regard not to my teaching, but to my time spent working as an engineer with Con Edison. So if you are aware, Con Edison is the power generator, transmitter, and distributor of electricity in New York City and the surrounding boroughs. And it was a world in which, when I first entered in the late 80s, was a construction company, basically, and everybody that I worked with had never worked with a woman before. I was the first woman in every department I worked in everywhere, and I was in working with the outside, the field operators and the guys who were going in manholes and substations and, hard hat, steel tip boots, and they did not know what to do with me. And I have to say that I dealt with my fair share of I guess it's not really bullying. It was just plain discrimination and just not non-acceptance, and understandably so, because they didn't know what to do with me. But I have to say that I am concerned that with the current climate and what we see as acceptable, with the public deems as acceptable, my fear is that some of that corporate culture, the people that feel this way, that she shouldn't be here or he shouldn't be here, will feel more emboldened to act on it and to speak to speak up and to, work harder to make the minority population feel unwelcome because of what we're seeing that's on the news and, in the White House. And so that concerns me tremendously, that there'll be validation, that people in companies will see validation in what happens in Washington, and that the climates and corporations will stop being less diplomatic and less egalitarian as a result. I know that I have friends in town who've reported that in the middle school, some really terrible things are being said to minority students and immigrant students. So, it's a continuum. And so if it's happening in the middle schools, it's going to be happening everywhere else. And so that's my biggest concern, is that it's going to become more rampant in industry.
We experienced the same thing in England after Brexit. Obviously, I was living in Chicago at the time, but there was a massive upswing in antisocial behavior, blatant racism that were aimed at people who were essentially mostly immigrants, and the entire framework was mostly for Polish people, but the entire framework was, well, look, we just voted to get rid of you because that's exactly the rhetoric of the Leave Party, and it's the same rhetoric that Trump used. But we also have to, I don't want to get into a political discussion about that, but we also have to understand why all those people were so angry. Is it purely education, or was there some other failing of the social contracts that we missed?
So, kind of along the same lines, I want to bring up that it's important. I think that most women recognize this. It's important for us to have male advocates, but these are really difficult conversations to have sometimes. So, I wonder if you could comment on maybe how we could do a better job of having these conversations with men who could be supportive and potential advocates. How can we foster that kind of support?
For me, it's reaching out to people who represent the system, right, and are willing to talk about it and the problems that are present there in an open framework. Most people, when I approach them, automatically tell me that they see what I'm talking about, they see the problems, and they're willing to accept them. Now, how many of them are paying lip service to my concerns and the concerns of my colleagues is hard to tell, but I would argue quite a lot of them probably. Reaching out to identify male and female advocates for improvements in or reduction in gender bias, improvements in gender representation is extremely important. And identifying those people that can have a big impact on rapid change in the field to see real movement quickly is the biggest thing that we can do. But it's difficult to, again, we'll come back to the implicit bias discussion we had at the beginning. It's very difficult to explain to people that there is a bias when they see the bias, or they don't see the bias because it is implicit. So we need renewed ways of discussing that effectively.
I get very upset when people who are working as advocates for girls turn down, and I've seen this happen where organizations will say, "Oh, sorry, we only want women to run these workshops because they're for girls," and I disagree completely. I think that women are just as biased against women in STEM as men are. And I think that men can be just as good advocates as women, and I don't think that there's any reason that that they wouldn't be. I do believe that female role models still play an important role, as we discussed before, but I think it's critical to pull in support from male mentors and from men in the field that you're working in to act as allies. The problem, as Jack is saying, though, is how do you find them? How do you make them? So my experience has been that in the electric distribution business is that the men who have daughters for whom they aspire, to reach good things, those are the men that tend to understand. And really, but beyond that, it's just it's individual to the person, and it's just some people will and some people will not. And as a woman working in engineering, you can ferret that out and figure out who's going to be your advocate and who could be your mentor. It absolutely could be a man, and more often than not, it probably will need to be, because there are fewer women in the field. So, in the field of most types of engineering. So I think it's important to not discount men and to actually embrace their contribution toward this movement.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Okay, so the last thing I kind of wanted to open up for is relative to the political outcome as well. Something that concerns me is the distrust of science that has been fostered. Do either of you want to comment on just basically the skepticism and distrust that somehow culminated in our society, particularly, I guess, the loudest of which is with respect to climate change?
So, So you're basically asking how did that mistrust occur in anti-intellectualism?
Maybe if you want to talk about how does it occur, and what do you think our role is as scientists, engineers, researchers to contribute to improving the situation?
We need to communicate with people in all walks of life, preventing what we see as, what they see as the elitism of our intellectual classes. We need to reach out to everybody and make sure that everybody hears the message from our side, so that the very vocal advocates for, say, anti-climate change aren't as loud as we are. We don't want to get into a shouting match, and and as intellectuals, often we hide away from the extremists because, to be perfectly honest, it's too hard to discuss or talk with them effectively. But we do need to go out and communicate with the people who aren't extremists, but who are undecided or innocent of the details and the facts that actually surround the topic in question. So that means going out and talking at church groups in underprivileged areas, or going and talking to research community leaders in community leaders in socioeconomic areas that are not necessarily particularly high. And even reaching out into agricultural rural areas and going and giving presentations and talking to school kids, and going out there and not being afraid to be avid and comprehensive communicators of the actual science. But for that, we need good communicators, and therefore the only way to do that is to train people to be good communicators and give them the tools so that they can have rhetoric which is more powerful than the anti-science rhetoric.
I actually am very concerned about this, in particular, what you're talking about, the distrust of science, because it is so anathema to me. I have a hard time understanding it, but I've been reading about it and listening to people speak about it. And I think that when topics become politicized, then it becomes, so for example, it's either climate change or else evolution, which has recently back in the news because of soon-to-be Vice President Pence. When they become political, when there's a political impact, when there's monetary impact, as in the climate change, and also when there's no immediacy to the resolution of the problem, such as with climate change, there's such a long-term and such a large topic that it's very easy for people to just push it aside. But the political part of it, and the bifurcation of our country into liberal and conservative, we have this confirmation bias where people are not willing to listen to anything that's outside their sphere of influence and political beliefs. And so I fear that there is nothing that we can say to convince the non-believers. And that frightens me more than anything. I don't know that there is something that we can say to them. I hope that Jack is right and that we can come up with the right words. But my fear is that we're talking two different languages, and our words will not be heard.
All right. Thank you both for your comments on that. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
All right.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It was a very interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed having the opportunity to at least take part. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the STEMxm podcast. Mariel and Jack were both great, and I want to say a huge thanks to them for taking the time to discuss these topics with us at such short notice. You can find this episode's show notes at STEMxm.com/episode 9. That's STEMxm.com/episode and then the number 9. I've included the things that Mariel mentioned, like a link to Carol Dweck's book about growth versus fixed mindset, as well as an article about the Cornell research she mentioned about majors being linked to high school job plans. I linked to Nano Girl's YouTube channel and her TED Talk, and then a couple of other things that I think you'll find useful or interesting. I'd love to hear from you if you enjoyed this episode or if you've got thoughts for improving a panel discussion on a future episode. Please reach out. You can send us a tweet to @STEMxm podcast, or you can head over to the website and get in touch with us there. It's just STEMxm.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you in episode 10.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.